Uh, Hi, everyone. I'm going to just sort of get things going, but we're going to have Eric introduce himself because Tara, Hudeberg, who is the host for this seminar, what did you say, Eric? She discovered she had a teaching conflict at this time all of a sudden, or
Yeah, she was double booked and she
uh,
is teaching right now.
anyway. That's a bummer. So Eric gets to introduce himself in terms of his background and accomplishments and all of that kind of stuff. And you know, as usual, I think we can have questions at the end, or you can fire them into the chat. And Eric, you can kind of, you know, the drill by now in terms of Zoom seminars. I'm sure you'll have questions that emerge in the chat, and then others that'll happen at the end of the seminar. And you can handle those as you see fit. Sound good?
Sounds very good, yeah.
All right, well, go ahead and do the self-intro now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So yeah, my name is Eric Walsh. I actually started in 2015 at Idaho working on a PhD under Dr. Tara Hudeberg. And during that time, I started working for the Nez Perce tribe, and I'm going to spend some time during this talk talking a little bit about that work. And did a postdoc starting in 2019 with Tara. And then I was just recently offered a research assistant professorship in the Department of Forest, Rangeland, and Fire Sciences just this last month. So Idaho, it's hard to get rid of me. So I'm going to spend most of this talk just talking about the work that I've been doing with the Nez Perce tribe and what's come out of my postdoc with them and some funding that we received recently and getting this project off the ground with in a collaboration with them working on agricultural related problems and questions. So without further, I will just get started. So in 2017, I started working with the Nez Perce tribe to help them develop a climate change vulnerability assessment. And the focus of this assessment was to fully document the projected effects that climate change would have on the tribe, on the Nez Perce people and their way of life. And this has led to several opportunities that have come to light because of the assessment. And to just provide some context for the Nez Perce themselves, their ancestral homeland spans approximately 11 million acres within the interior Columbia Basin. And in this map that hopefully you're seeing, the light green area is the Indian Claims Commission usual and accustomed area of the Nez Perce tribe, and they have treaty rights that are ceded to them within this area. And then within this region is the reservation itself, and that's the dark green polygon. And the reservation is about 770,000 acres, located at the confluence of the Snake River and the Clearwater River. And so as part of my work on the vulnerability assessment, I was looking at how landscape dynamics would respond to climate change across Nez Perce country, and specifically wanted to understand, what are the vulnerable habitats of this region, what are vulnerable species, and what are the vulnerable ecosystem services as we move forward through the 21st century. And so one thing that we looked at was how resilient is the Nez Perce landscape to climate change? And this was based on research conducted by the TNC looking at landscape resiliency in terms of climate change. And resiliency here was a measure of ecological resiliency, or the flow or movement of species and genes and energy across the landscape. So how well or conducive would the landscape be to movement in such that in a climatic niche, if you will, how much of the landscape would present itself as a barrier, and that would indicate how resilient the landscape would be. And so the Nez Perce landscape itself in this ICC area that you see in this map, it's dominated by a mix of forest and agricultural land use and cover. And it's a mix of climate ecological resiliency. And one of the key conclusions that came out of this assessment of the TNC work that we used was the broader region, this ICC area, is above average ecological resiliency to climate change. However, the reservation itself was within this lobe of the landscape, this red polygon, up in the kind of northwest portion of the ICC, is of lower resiliency. And so the reservation contains a significant portion of the landscape that functions as a barrier to species movement, gene flow, energy movement across the landscape. And so that lower resiliency is driven in large part by agricultural land use. When we started to look specifically at what were the landscape dynamics that were driving this, we realized that the agricultural land use is approximately 46% of the reservation, and most of the areas that were of lower ecological resiliency also coincided with ag land use, and many of the areas of higher resiliency were along riparian areas and riverine corridors. So we realized that agriculture was a major player in terms of what sort of ecological resiliency would happen across the landscape as we move forward. But one question that obviously comes from that is that if agriculture is posing itself as an ecological barrier, how well or how resilient is agriculture to climate change itself, so the production systems themselves? So how resilient would we expect agriculture to be to climate change in this area, since it represents about 50% of the working landscape of the reservation? And so when we looked at some of the work that had been done on agriculture itself and how resilient it was, there's a significant portion of the reservation ag lands that are in cropland. And croplands are classified into these agroecological classes. And these classes are broadly related to precipitation regimes. And the reservation is dominated by an annual cropping system, meaning that there's higher annual precipitation within the area, and so annual cropping is possible. And the distribution of these agroecological classes across the broader ICC area around the reservation was projected to transition to a grain fallow system as climatic extremes such as growing season drought increase. And these grain fallow systems are less resilient to climate change. However, at the reservation scale, there was a greater amount of annual cropping projected in the future, and these annual cropping systems are less vulnerable to future uncertainties of weather and economic forces because of crop diversity and potential. So though the reservation landscape is ecologically less resilient to climate change, the dominant land use, agriculture, actually appeared to be positioned well, if you will, for climatic change in the future and likely be resilient. So why focus on agriculture? Well, obviously one of the reasons is that it's a dominant land use within the reservation. There's an ecological component to it that it's affecting landscape resiliency. But one of the second reasons to focus on agriculture too, in terms of assessing what are the effects and how this would impact the tribe, is that agriculture and climate change will interact, and agriculture actually provides a means to solve climate change. So the agriculture sector needs globally to increase its production while concurrently addressing climate change through adaptation and mitigation processes. And we realized that to improve the resiliency of the Nez Perce landscape to climate change, we needed to focus on agriculture. We needed to facilitate a regional process of helping agriculture adapt to climate change, improve landscape scale processes, such as species movements across the landscape and ecological connectivity, and use agriculture as a solution to climate change itself. And so with that in mind, in 2019, we received funding from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to study agriculture and climate change. And the objective was to document in a climate smart ag situation analysis the current state of agriculture across the reservation as a means to identify the inroads and the opportunities to improve ag systems across the landscape, And this was not just about identifying the ag practices themselves that could improve production in the face of climate change, but it was to also better understand how concepts like food sovereignty, food security, institutional barriers to change, et cetera, things like that would interact with climate change. And to really understand what's happening and where we needed to go and what were the pathways to get there in terms of making agriculture more resilient and ensuring that we were also improving landscape dynamics and ecosystem services. So I mentioned that we were doing a climate smart ag situation analysis. So I just want to take a moment to explain what climate smart ag is for those that maybe aren't familiar. So climate smart ag, it provides a solution to agricultural production in the face of climate change. It's not a reinvention of the wheel, but rather it takes existing practices and principles and focuses them on a framework of climate change so that ag practices themselves are evaluated at a local scale to maximize what Climate Smart Ag calls 3 pillars: production, adaptation, and mitigation as those relate to climate change. So a land manager then filters or grades ag practices against these 3 pillars and evaluates the trade-offs and the synergies that can be produced through these 3 pillars. And then identifies the best practices to implement for local needs and conditions. So in part, a climate smart ag system is based on the principles of regenerative ag and conservation ag. So they're intended to improve things like soil quality, ecosystem biodiversity, farm productivity through the use of ecosystem processes, and an overall minimization or elimination of non-natural inputs into the system, such as pesticides and herbicides. And so we really felt that this was the right system to begin to focus our ag questions and decision-making processes through, because we were interested in not only improving ag processes and productivity and building resiliency as it related to climate change, and making sure that we were focusing on that as we move forward. So I'm just going to take a moment next to present some overview results that we have from the situation analysis and use it as a means to why the tribe itself is in a position to lead on addressing climate change resiliency within their traditional homeland. So just some baseline information about the reservation itself to put things into context. So a majority of the reservation is under private ownership. Approximately 16% of the reservation lands are actually under the tribe's jurisdiction. So if you look at the insert pie graph, though, just over 50% of the lands that are within their jurisdiction are actually in agricultural land use. So much of this land is leased by the tribe government or by tribal members to non-tribal farmers in an effort to generate revenue for government programs or individual families. So these leases and agricultural lands are an economic engine for the tribe. So you take it as a whole, overall, the tribe manages a minority portion of their landscape, but what they do manage, over half of it is actually in agricultural land use. And so the tribe is in a position to lead at this intersection of climate change and agriculture through the management of their lands and the leases that they allow on their ag properties. From an economic standpoint, for this region, agricultural productivity is also tied to the well-being of the regional economy. Approximately 11% of the reservation population, and this is both tribe and non-tribe members, are in agricultural-related industries. And the total product market value of farming productivity or production across the reservation is, as of the 2017 Census of Agriculture, was 89.5 million. But food security and sovereignty, as I mentioned earlier, these are drivers for the tribe too to lead on. When we look at the so an estimated 12 to 17 million in food is consumed, $1 million in food is consumed in the 3 major towns of the reservation of Lapwai, Kamiah, and Orofino. And of that consumption, 95% are from products that are produced or imported from outside the area. So this ultimately results in a $14 million import-export deficit to the reservation. So the agriculture economy affects the opportunity for employment and the stability of the tribe's economic and enterprise endeavors. But it's also a means for improving tribal sovereignty and food security and bringing economic value back and trying to retain it as much as possible across the reservation, and building in resiliency from that point of view. In terms of that food sovereignty and economic development for tribe members themselves, unfortunately, active participation in ag production activities is extremely low amongst tribal members. And there seems to be a real opportunity here. So in that 2017 census, specifically for reservation itself and the extents of the reservation, of the 908 producers that responded, only 6 producers identified themselves as Native American, and only 2 reported farming as their primary activity. And even in terms of annual sales, Native American operations appear to be disproportionately associated with lower economic output. 4 of those 6 operations each accounted for less than $5,000 each in annual sales, with only 1 reporting greater than $100,000 in annual sales. So again, from an economic point of view, the tribe is extracting value from leasing lands, but the individual tribe members themselves are not engaged at the producer scale to extract economic value from this engine that's happening across their reservation. So I provided some background on just the economics and the and the situation regarding food sovereignty and food security, but much of our original work was really just focused on understanding how practices have evolved and where the opportunities are to improve practices to increase regenerative ag implementation across the reservation. So one positive sign that we found is that at least 80% of the reported harvested acres being farmed are being farmed under complete or partial no-till practices. So this is a significant step towards implementation of regenerative ag practices and building towards a climate smart ag system. And a lot of this came about because of investments and work by the Nez Perce tribe. So the Nez Perce tribe Water Resources Division, through the EPA's non-point source pollution prevention program, has assisted landowners and producers in implementing no-till farming or low-till farming practices and direct drilling across much of the reservation. And this dates back to the early 2000s. So they're making steps towards that. But in terms of other opportunities for increasing regenerative ag practices, one practice is ensuring that your soil is not bare for good portions of the year. And so it comes down to, say, increasing cover crop implementation. And so that is actually happening at a low implementation rate. In the 2017 census, it appears that only about 1% of the cropland that was in use across the reservation was actually planted to cover crops. So what we see here is that the tribe has implemented programs to support producers that improve soil health, to affect literally and figuratively downstream processes, so such as overland soil erosion, to minimize total maximum loads into waterways and riverines and lakes and such. But there's still a real opportunity to continue to build in, so that what we saw was, okay, we can understand what has worked with the no-till initiatives, right? And how do we use that information and those processes to then to step into areas like cover cropping and increasing the use of cover crop across the area. So just as a review of what I've kind of discussed so far, agriculture is this major land use within the reservation. And at the reservation, the landscape itself is ecologically less resilient to climate change, but cropland agriculture, which is a dominant land use across the reservation, seems to be prepared well for future climatic changes. So agriculture management provides this opportunity then to improve the social ecological functions of the Nez Perce lands while also adapting and mitigating climate change. And so we saw this as a real opportunity, but through discussions with producers, we really began to understand that change can be slow, difficult, and sometimes it lacks support. So producers in this area that we've had conversations with, they've started experimenting with and they're learning about regenerative ag practices such as cover cropping, direct drilling, integrative grazing, but they've encountered barriers along the way like crop failure, crop insurance support, capital investments in equipment, and sometimes just a lack of specific knowledge of practices that work in their very specific locations within this region. Because even across the reservation, there's a dynamic in terms of even soil types and what can be supported and what works and what doesn't. So much of the research and development that's actually has happened or has been needed in this area to improve productivity and agricultural resiliency has been done at the regional scale by universities. So for instance, the REACH program that the University of Idaho has been involved in, the Regional Approaches to Climate Change, or the LIT program, the Landscape in Transition. This is ongoing research for understanding how climate change interacts with agriculture. But what we were realizing as talking with producers is that, some producers have experienced success and they've used this information, but others, when confronted with new challenges, were just unable to find or locate technical support that's needed, and just not knowing where to start and what they should do. Because sometimes these technologies are really new and the ideas are new to the people across the reservation itself. So what we did was we identified this need and we developed this proposal to address the needs, and we submitted it to the USDA through their NIFA program, or the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. And so this fall, we were awarded this NIFA grant to develop a framework that fosters a participatory process to address the landscape issues that we see. So the framework is comprised of what we're calling collaborators, and these are going to be extension agents, producers, tribe resource managers, researchers, actively experimenting and implementing practices, which we're calling regenerative ag practices, at the intersection of traditional ecological knowledge of the tribe itself. So the project is about applied science and understanding how practices that have been researched within the context of climate change, so think the REACH program or the LIT program, how can these be fully utilized by producers across the reservation itself to improve ecosystem services at that landscape scale? So when we're talking about ecosystem services, we're thinking about things like improving pollinator and wildlife habitat, stream temperatures and stream quality, and culturally relevant plant communities as examples of ecosystem services that we would like to understand how they respond when ag practices are shifted. And so this is really about a systemic thinking. It's about, oops, I'm sorry. It's about bringing that approach of climate change problems faced by the tribe. We're dealing with a working landscape that is of lower ecological resiliency with regards to climate change, but the production systems themselves are likely positioned well for future changes. We have a First Nations people that are not fully realizing the economic benefits of the working landscape that they reside within, but are bearing much of the ecological costs of the practices currently in place. So we're looking at the social ecological issues, and we're wanting to improve landscape scale problems like ecological connectivity. But both literally and figuratively, looking at the downstream landscape effects as we do this. And so the solutions that we are looking at, they have to start with the on the ground ag practices, because those are the practices that are having reverberating effects across these other scales, right? So what we're saying is that by not only addressing ag practices, by concurrently building stakeholder networks, having the tribe lead on implementation, having the tribe show and produce positive results, we're taking into account the entire social ecological system and the effects that that has on the emergent outcomes that the region experiences. And so that's what we're hoping to do with this NEFA grant, this seed grant essentially. And so our approach then with this grant and our to this systemic thinking and problem, right, is we're leveraging this project to build a coalition of locally engaged stakeholders to build out the use of regenerative and climate smart ag across this landscape. So we see this as an opportunity to not only engage in research focused on improving ecosystem services, but to build into the program an experiential learning experience that addresses the personal spheres of regional producers. And so we've broken this out into two themes: practices and collaborators. So the practices theme is this synergistic interaction of three supporting pieces: the ag practices themselves, the traditional ecological knowledge and the culturally relevant plants to the tribe community, and the tribal lands themselves and the support that the tribe can provide. I didn't really talk a lot about traditional ecological knowledge and how that plays a role, but just basically and briefly, you know, tribes throughout the Americas have TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, about how to manage native plants and landscapes. And Western agriculturists, for perspective, have been farming here for 160 years, while the Nez Perce people have lived in the Columbia River Basin for at least 17,000 years. So there's a significant amount of place-based knowledge, especially around native plants and the ecological functions of the landscape. And things like the horticultural practices that we use in surplus food plant production by the Nez Perce people, you know, these are important practices to begin to understand because they provide insight into how those culturally relevant plants and those practices interact with the climate and environment of this landscape. And so the tribe, again, is in this unique position to demonstrate the intersection of regenerative agriculture with traditional ecological knowledge, and providing the proving ground and the support for how these practices can work within the region. We've talked with producers that are working towards more regenerative ag implementation, and they have said that they would like to see the tribe lead on these efforts within this region because they think that that is where real change will happen and is possible at scalable effects, right? The second piece of this process, so we talked about the practices. The second piece is the collaborators, and it's the social science aspect. It's the leveraging of this participatory process, bringing together university extension agents, state extension agents, producers, researchers, tribe resource managers, and these are the individuals that are going to be the primary mode of implementation. So the power then of this participatory process is to bring together this diverse group of people to come up with these synergistic ideas of how we solve these problems. And the objective is to transfer the decision-making process and the power to the stakeholders directly affected by and engaged in the results. Because often, as we've seen and we've talked with producers, you know, they are the agents investigating about how to make some of these changes and trial and error, measuring and studying, and they're collaborating with university researchers. So we want to step into that process and really build a foundation around it to make change intentional. And so the collaborators will have this opportunity to define their goals, set research agendas that best serve their needs, as well as what are the needs of the landscape. So the goals that we hope to get out of this project as we move forward is to build this participatory framework that's going to bring together the ag practices and the stakeholder collaboration to support a build out of implementation of CSA across the reservation. So what we want to see is we want to see more buy-in to climate smart ag and regenerative ag practices across the reservation and try to scale that up. We want to engage in research and facilitate the process of researching regenerative ag practices that intersect with traditional ecological knowledge to produce desired ecosystem services across this region. And what we hope to produce out of this is the decision support tool that will address climate-based agricultural decisions for the reservation. So it will be used, we're going to use the research from this project and the knowledge and the expertise of extension agents and university researchers and the tribe resource managers and the producers themselves to basically inform and assist managers and producers in implementing agroecological land management decisions moving forward. So we just started this project literally in January, and I just want to describe some of the progress and the results that we've made. So, so in practice, what have we done? So we are working with the tribe, and this is a collaborative effort between the University of Idaho and the Nez Perce tribe. The Nez Perce was also awarded a sub-award as part of this grant. And we are looking at some of their wildlife mitigation lands that are currently in ag production, but those are going to age out, and eventually they would like to restore the landscape to native prairie and forest land cover. And in order to do that, we're now talking and working on how do we come up with a 10-year plan to use the agriculture production that is going to occur between now and when these land leases are over with to actually regenerate the landscape and prepare it for restoration efforts as we move towards restoring grassland prairies and forest ecosystems. So that's one area that we're using this grant to work towards. The other is we're working with now two private producers. One producer is looking at new technologies to implement on his ag lands to increase soil carbon sequestration and minimize non-natural inputs such as fertilizers and herbicides. And so we're working on a collaborative effort with this particular producer and some extension agents from the region to come up with some experimental designs to study the implementation of these technologies. And we also want to look at, this particular producer has been implementing regenerative ag practices for several years now, and we would like to begin to document the changes that have been occurring across his landscape and compare those to areas where the regenerative ag practices are not in place, so we can begin to capture the dynamics of how these ag practices are affecting downstream, both literally and figuratively, landscape scale ecosystem services. And then we are also working with a second producer who is just at the beginning of this process. So they are really interested in making changes towards more regenerative ag implementation. They're working with NRCS, with manure management systems, but they want to take those things a step further, and they're looking at questions of how do we transition some of our land to pasture, and we do that in a sustainable and regenerative ag way. And so again, we're bringing together a group of extension agents and resource managers who can begin to help them frame a working plan that will work for them to make the changes that they're interested in making. And then as we do that, we are going to be then collecting data points on the changes that are happening and tracking the results so that we understand how, as they make these changes, what sort of effects does this have at the landscape scale itself. So, and with that, I just want to mention that, you know, this framework that does represent big goals and long-term implications. So this proposal that we're working off it's the key piece, and it's intended to address the inertia of forming this framework and towards initial implementation, and so that we can produce small traceable results, and then identify what the pitfalls and the opportunities are so that we can scale this up in the future. And so we are also looking at how do we use this process to fund future grants, such as conservation innovation grants. We tried for one last year, and then working towards bigger grants like the coordinated agricultural projects. So we're in this beginning phase with this project now of building a collaboration. So if any of this seems of interest, or you have some resources, or you think there's a collaboration opportunity, please reach out to me. I would love to have a conversation, because this takes a lot of people with a lot of different knowledge and expertise sets. And our goal is to bring those people together and create a network as best we can to solve these issues across the landscape. If you need something also to walk away with or share, we have a story map that tells a good portion of the story that I shared today. And this little mini URL will bring you there. And with that, I will take any questions. Thank you. Okay. I am not seeing a chat box, so if you just want to unmute yourself and ask a question. I saw some hands go up and then I see hands disappear. So I can call on anybody. If somebody has a chat box and they see questions, if you don't mind, Alicia or Barry, want to ask those questions out loud, or?
So Lee, why don't you just unmute yourself and ask? There is a question from Lee Wang in the chat, but Lee, if you can just unmute yourself, I think, and Eric, you can probably just stop sharing your screen. It might be easier to see who's got questions, and you know that might help a lot.
Okay.
Oh yeah, thank you, Eric. It's a very interesting work. So I think my question is that would you consider like comparative studies, comparing the Nez Perce with other, conservation lands, other trap lands as one of your goals?
Yeah. So is the question, would we consider converging some of our questions and our research with other research endeavors? Is that the question?
Yes, with other research or study areas. Yeah.
Yeah, 100% we are. I am absolutely interested in also bringing into the fold other people doing ag research that would be interested in asking their questions across the reservation extents, and how whatever they're doing would interact with whatever the tribe is doing, and where the tribe would also like to lead on agriculture. So I am 100% ready and willing to do collaborations in terms of research with regards to this, and looking for synergistic interactions where some things have already been researched, but maybe there's some questions about, across the reservation extent, if we do implement these things. From my perspective, what I'm most interested in is understanding how, when you do change these ag practices, how downstream, and literally and figuratively, landscape scale processes change. So how can we improve ecological connectivity? How do we improve habitat? How do we improve stream health and things like that? And in order to do those things, what we have identified is that we need to start with agriculture because it's such a dominant land use. But there's experts, and I'm not an expert in agriculture, so that's why our approach has been to build a collaboration of experts so that they can address the ag parts of it, and then we can focus on collecting our landscape scale data that we're interested in and how those respond when you change those ag practices. But we are definitely open to further collaboration for sure.
Yeah, thank you. If you don't mind, I have another small question. So maybe I skip that part. will be the water availability be the one of the kind of limitation to this kind of smart agriculture for climate adaptation?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, the question is that will the water availability in that area be the limitation to the practices of the smart agriculture?
Oh, so how will water availability affect some of these ag implementations? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess so. First and foremost, irrigation is not highly implemented across this landscape. So it is a dryland ag system for the most part. And water availability obviously does play a role in that. And we are interested in to know, like one thing that we are interested in knowing is how that plays a role with cover cropping. So when talking with some producers lately, they've struggled with finding cover crops that work within their landscape. And I'm specifically thinking about people, producers that are in the Clearwater County, because some of the soil dynamics that occur within that area have limited cover cropping abilities, and they've had cover crop failures. And so one of the things that I think we would like to find money to do is to research how we can get cover cropping to be implemented at a greater extent. And I think a lot of that is driven by the success and failure of producers, and they try it and they fail and they don't know why they're failing. And so they stop implementing it. And water availability certainly plays a role in that. So understanding those dynamics, I think, would be really important to increasing just the actual implementation of cover cropping across this area.
Yeah, good. Yeah, thank you, Eric. Yeah, good
Thank
job.
you.
Yeah.
Hi, Eric. This is Vincent.
Hi, Vincent.
I had a question about when you use the word producers, are you working with any ranchers or livestock producers across the reservation or that study area?
Yeah, so the two producers that we are actively working right now, both do grazeland management. One of the producers actually does, I believe he's running heads of sheep, if I'm correct. And then we have another producer that has cattle. And the producer that has cattle, for example, they're doing that manure management system I was mentioning. And they're interested in transitioning some of their landscape from cropland to pasture because they think that that's a better move for them, but they're not really sure how to make that transition and also how to do it in such a way that would be sustainable. So they're starting, we're in the beginning process of that. And what we're doing is we're trying to capture with them what their goals and objectives are. And then our process is to bring in, April Hewlett has been one of the collaborators on this project. And then we're working with soil scientist, Eileen Rowland. And kind of what our hope is to bring these people together and have a discussion about, here's what this producer is trying to achieve. What are your thoughts and what do you think the best pathways are, to give them options to figure out what's going to work for them. So I know that's a long answer, but we at least have two producers that do some ranching and are looking for solutions.
Great, thanks.
So if you are a grazing, holistic integrative grazing expert, or you have knowledge of that, please reach out to me. We'd love to bring you into the network and then leverage your expertise to help with these these questions.
Yeah, I just put a tool that actually NKN helped make that is dealing with some grasslands within the traditional study, or not, what's the traditional Nez Perce treaty lands on the Zumwalt Prairie. So we have a mapping tool for those grassland systems. So I just thought maybe if people were running cows or sheep on traditional bunch grass vegetation, some of these tools could help in some way.
Great, thank you. I will take a look at that.
And yeah, I might reach out later anyway. So thanks for the presentation. It was great.
Thank you.
Looks like we're coming up on last call for questions in terms of being 1:19. Anybody else want to jump in? Alicia's spamming the YouTube channel. Eric, any last words then? And I don't think there's any more questions.
No, but I just want to mention again, you know, we are trying to network. So if you think anything interacts with whatever you're doing, please reach out. This is really about coalition building and getting scalable results, and we need as many people with expertise as possible. So please reach out to me.
Great. Well, thanks so much for giving the seminar this week. That was really cool.